Amina Khan never expected to be tackled, cuffed and thrown into a police car for simply studying late at night, but that's exactly what happened. A Muslim medical student, exhausted from long shifts and endless exams, was harassed and arrested by cops who saw her hijab before her humanity. They laughed, mocked her, and dragged her into court like a criminal. But the moment she spoke, the entire room fell silent. They had no idea who she really was, a highly decorated army combat medic who had saved lives on the battlefield. And when the truth finally hit them, their faces said it all. Before we dive into this jaw-dropping story, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe, because tomorrow we've got something you won't want to miss. Amina Khan pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to focus as the fluorescent lights of the hospital library buzzed softly above her. It was nearly midnight, and the silence of the empty room wrapped around her like a cocoon. A thick medical textbook lay open in front of her, the dense paragraphs blurring together. Her body ached from exhaustion, but there was no time for rest. Between endless exams and hospital rotations, sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. She took a deep breath and sat back in her chair, rolling her stiff shoulders. The only sound in the room was the soft scratching of her pen as she jotted down notes, forcing herself to stay alert. The smell of old paper and antiseptic lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of the coffee she'd finished hours ago. Amina glanced toward the glass doors leading into the hallway. The hospital at night had a strange stillness, a quiet that was both comforting and unsettling. Nurses moved in and out of patient rooms, their footsteps muffled against the polished floors. Beyond the glass, a uniformed security guard leaned against the reception desk, his gaze flicking toward her. She knew that look, suspicious, calculating. It wasn't new. She had spent years enduring stares like that, people seeing her hijab before they saw her. She exhaled slowly, willing herself to ignore it. Tonight, she wasn't a soldier, a fighter, or a target. She was just a medical student trying to survive. Another night of studying. Shaking off the discomfort, Amina gathered her notes and packed up her bag. The night air would clear her head. She stepped out of the library, stretching as she made her way toward the hospital's side exit. The second she stepped outside, she felt it, a presence. Before she could turn, a sharp voice cut through the quiet. "Hey, stop right there!" Amina froze. Her pulse quickened as two police officers approached, their hands hovering near their holsters. "What are you doing out here this late?" one of them demanded, his tone thick with authority. Amina swallowed, keeping her voice calm. "I'm a medical student. I was studying in the hospital library." The officer's eyes flicked over her, stopping at the hijab wrapped neatly around her head. His expression darkened. "You got ID?" She nodded and reached into her pocket, moving slowly. "Yeah, it's right. Hands where I can see them." Her heart slammed against her ribs as both officers reached for their belts. She stopped, moving instantly, holding her hands up in surrender. "It's just my ID," she said, forcing her voice to stay even. "I'm a student here." One of the officers stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "Funny, because we got a report about someone loitering near restricted areas." Amina clenched her jaw. "I haven't left the library. Check the cameras." The second officer scoffed. "We ask the questions, you answer." Amina could feel the heat rising in her face. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to defend herself, but she forced her training down. She knew how this would go if she resisted. "Tajidi." First officer grabbed her arm hard. "Let's take this downtown." Amina's breath caught as the officer's fingers clamped around her arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. Instinct kicked in. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to break free, to pivot and disarm him in one swift motion. She had done it before, overseas, in situations where hesitation meant death. But this wasn't a war zone. This was home. She forced herself to stay still, muscles locked, her pulse hammering against her skin. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, voice steady, despite the anger rising in her throat. The officer yanked her forward. "You're trespassing. You're out here looking suspicious in the middle of the night." "I told you, I'm a medical student, she repeated, biting back the urge to snap. I have every right to be here. The second officer chuckled. Yeah, and I'm the damn Surgeon General. Amina gritted her teeth. This wasn't about logic. This wasn't about checking her ID. They had already made up their minds. The library, the scrubs, none of it mattered. They saw her hijab and had drawn their own conclusions. The first officer spun her around and shoved her against the side of the building. Pain flared in her shoulder as rough hands wrenched her arms behind her back. Cold metal snapped around her wrists. Her vision blurred. For a second, her body stiff with the effort to keep still. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but she knew where that would lead. The officers turned her around, and for the first time, she saw the small crowd gathering near the hospital entrance. Nurses, interns, even a few patients watching. Some had their phones out, recording, but none of them stepped in. "Someone tell them," she shouted, her voice sharp, desperate. "I work here." A nurse she recognized, Emily, someone she had assisted in the ER just 2 nights ago, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Others averted their eyes. Cowards. Amina's chest tightened as the officers hauled her toward the waiting squad car. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. "No," the first officer said, shoving her inside. "We're doing our job." The door slammed shut. Amina sat rigidly, the scent of stale sweat and old leather filling the confined space. Her hands throbbed where the cuffs bit into her wrists. The officers laughed outside, exchanging smug remarks she couldn't fully hear. She stared straight ahead, fury burning through her exhaustion. She had spent years patching up soldiers in combat zones, keeping them alive under fire, holding their hands as they bled out in the dirt. She had done everything right, served her country, followed the rules, worked harder than anyone, and still she was here. The engine rumbled to life. As the car pulled away, Amina didn't look back. She had a feeling this wasn't over. The squad. Car's interior was suffocating, the air thick with the stale scent of sweat and vinyl. Amina sat rigid in the back seat, her wrists burning from the too tight cuffs. Every pothole sent a jolt through her spine, but she refused to react. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her wince. The officers in the front chuckled, their casual banter grating against her nerves. "Another one trying to play innocent," the driver muttered, shaking his head. His partner scoffed. "Yeah, they always do. Probably got fake student papers. We'll check her out, see what else she's hiding." Amina clenched her jaw. She had spent years training herself to stay calm in moments like this, during explosions, under enemy fire, with a wounded soldier bleeding out beneath her hands. But this was different. This was an attack on everything she had fought for. She turned her gaze to the window, the city streets flashing by in streaks of amber light. Somewhere out there, her classmates were studying for exams, reviewing charts, living normal lives. But she wasn't allowed normal, was she? The car pulled into the station, tires crunching against loose gravel. The officers yanked her out roughly, and she stumbled as her feet hit the pavement. "Watch yourself," one of them muttered, shoving her forward. Amina bit back the sharp retort bubbling in her throat. Instead, she lifted her chin and walked ahead, her posture straight despite the weight of humiliation pressing down on her. Inside, the fluorescent lights of the precinct cast everything in an artificial glow. The air smelled of sweat, burnt coffee, and the faint metallic tang of something sour. Murmurs rippled through the station as she was led past rows of desks, officers looking up from their paperwork, some curious, others indifferent. "Booking rooms open," a desk sergeant called. Amina was steered toward a chair. One officer unlocked her cuffs, but before she could roll her wrists to ease the ache, her hands were roughly guided onto an ink pad, then pressed against a fingerprint sheet. "What's the charge?" a bored-looking officer asked. The one who arrested her smirked. "Trespassing, resisting." Amina's eyes snapped to him. "Resisting?" "You pulled away," he said, shrugging. "That's resisting." Her fingers curled into fists. She wanted to argue, but she could already see how useless it would be. They weren't interested in the truth. They had already decided what she was. The officer handling her booking barely looked at her as he scribbled something on a form. "Name?" She exhaled slowly. "Amina Khan." A pause. His eyes flicked up to her hijab, then back down to the paperwork. "You a citizen?" The question sent a fresh wave of fury through her, but she kept her voice steady. "Born and raised in Texas," he grunted, shoving the form aside. "Take her to holding." The next thing she knew, she was being led down a dim corridor, the air growing heavier with each step. A steel door swung open, and she was pushed inside. The cell was small, barely big enough for the narrow bench along the wall. The door clanged shut behind her, the finality of it ringing in her ears. She sat, pressing her back against the cold concrete. In worse situations. She had survived war zones, patched up soldiers with shaking hands and blood-soaked uniforms. But sitting here, treated like a criminal in her own country, she felt something she never had before, betrayed. She closed her eyes and exhaled. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The hours dragged on in the holding cell, the cold from the concrete bench seeping through Amina's scrubs. She sat with her back against the wall, arms folded tightly across, her chest, her mind racing. The walls around her were covered in faint scratches, marks left behind by those who had been here before. The air smelled of sweat and cheap disinfectant, heavy with the staleness of captivity. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, followed by the low murmur of officers laughing amongst themselves. Every so often, one would walk by, glancing in at her, before moving on, as if checking on a caged animal. Amina's wrists still throbbed from the cuffs, a dull, persistent ache. She flexed her fingers, rolling her shoulders to keep her blood flowing. She had been trained to handle worse, extreme conditions, exhaustion, pain, but it didn't change the fact that she shouldn't be here. The sound of keys jangling snapped her out of her thoughts. The heavy steel door groaned open, and a uniformed officer gestured for her to stand. "Let's go." Amina rose, her body stiff from sitting for so long. She was led out of the cell and down a narrow hallway, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The station had quieted now, the chaos from earlier settling into an eerie stillness. When she reached the processing desk, a man in a cheap suit stood waiting, flipping through a stack of papers. He looked up, giving her a half-hearted nod. "Amina." "Khan." She nodded. "I'm your public defender," he said, stuffing the papers into a folder. "You've been charged with trespassing and resisting arrest." He didn't even look up as he spoke, his tone flat, uninterested. Amina's jaw tightened. "I didn't trespass. I was in my own hospital, studying." The lawyer sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, well, that's not how they see it. You were in a restricted area." "That's not true," she shot back. "There are cameras. Security footage. They can check." "They won't," he interrupted, glancing at her for the first time. "Look, these cases don't go far. You'll probably get a fine, maybe some community service." Amina let out a slow breath, barely believing what she was hearing. Community service? For what? Sitting in a library? The lawyer shrugged. "The sooner you accept the plea, the sooner you walk out of here." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had fought to save lives in war zones, bled for this country, and now she was being treated like a criminal for existing in a place where she belonged. "I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do," she said firmly. The lawyer sighed again, looking down at his papers. "Then we take it to court." Amina straightened her posture. She had faced worse than this. "Fine," she said. "Let's go to court." The transport van jerked forward, the hard seat beneath Amina barely offering any cushion, metal cuffs dug into her wrists, chaining her to the bench. The air inside was stale, filled with the low murmurs of other detainees shifting uncomfortably in their restraints. Amina sat still, her back straight, eyes fixed on the small barred window above her. She had been in worse vehicles, cramped military transports, emergency medical helicopters shaking from turbulence, Humvees rolling through hostile terrain, but none of them had ever felt as suffocating as this. The van finally pulled to a stop, the engine rumbling before cutting off. A moment later, the heavy doors swung open, flooding the interior with blinding morning light. "Let's go," an officer barked. Amina stepped out, her shoes scraping against the rough pavement. The courthouse loomed in front of her, grey and imposing. Flanked by officers, she was led up the steps past the staring eyes of people entering and leaving the building. Some whispered, Others avoided looking at her at all. She didn't care. Inside, the fluorescent lights were just as harsh as the ones at the station. The officers escorted her down a long hallway, pausing at a heavy wooden door before pushing it open. The courtroom was already filled, lawyers flipping through documents, police officers chatting with the prosecutor, the judge reviewing notes. At the bench, a few people sat in the audience, their faces unreadable. Then she saw them. The two officers who had arrested her stood near the prosecutor's table, their stance casual, confident, like they had already won. One of them smirked when he met her eyes. Amina felt a slow, simmering anger rise in her chest. She was led to her seat, the wooden chair creaking slightly as she sat. Her public defender barely glanced at her, shuffling through papers with an air of disinterest. The judge cleared his throat. Case number 45873, the state versus his suit jacket. Your Honor, the defendant was found trespassing in a restricted hospital area and resisted lawful detainment. Officers on the scene reported non-compliance, and that's not true. Amina cut in before she could stop herself. A few heads turned. The judge arched an eyebrow. Her lawyer shot her a warning glance but said nothing. The prosecutor continued smoothly. Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative when approached by officers and attempted to leave after being questioned. Amina's nails dug into her palms. I was trying to show them my ID. The judge looked at her, then at the prosecutor. Was she asked for identification? The prosecutor hesitated. The officers felt the situation was answer. The question, the judge said, his voice sharper now. A brief pause. Yes, Your Honor. But she reached into her pocket aggressively. Amina exhaled slowly. This was going to be a fight, and she was ready for it. Amina sat rigid in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests as the prosecutor continued spinning the story, twisting every moment of her arrest into something it wasn't. Words like aggressive, uncooperative, and suspicious behavior filled the air, each one pressing down on her like a weight. She had seen this before, heard it in the voices of commanding officers, in the whispers of soldiers who didn't think she belonged, in the careful wording of reports meant to justify the unjustifiable. Her lawyer, who had barely spoken, finally cleared his throat. Your Honor, my client was in a public hospital library, a place she has access to as a medical student. There's no evidence she was in a restricted area, and she made no attempt to evade law enforcement. The judge turned back to the prosecutor. Does the state have surveillance footage proving she was anywhere she shouldn't have been? The room fell into a brief but tense silence. Amina saw the prosecutor hesitate, shifting uncomfortably. No, Your Honor, he admitted finally. The footage does not clearly show any trespassing, but then why was she approached in the first place? One of the arresting officers, the same one who had smirked at her earlier, cleared his throat and stepped forward. Your Honor, we were responding to a call from hospital security about someone loitering near an entrance. Given the time of night and the circumstances, we deemed it necessary to investigate. Amina exhaled sharply through her nose. I was sitting in the library, studying, like hundreds of other students do every single day. The officer didn't look at her. We didn't know that at the time. The judge narrowed his eyes. Did she present ID when asked? The officer hesitated. She reached into her pocket. Given the situation, we had reason to believe. You didn't answer my question. The courtroom was completely silent now. Amina felt every pair of eyes in the room, shifting between her, the judge, and the officer. No, Your Honor, the officer finally said, voice clipped. A muscle twitched. In the judge's jaw, he leaned forward slightly. Let me get this straight. You detained a woman who was legally allowed to be there because she reached into her pocket for an ID that you asked her to produce. Neither officer spoke. Amina's lawyer, sensing the moment shifting, sat up straighter. Your Honor, my client has no prior record. She's a medical student and she's also a U.S. Army veteran, Amina said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The prosecutor's head snapped up. The smirk vanished from the officer's face. Even her lawyer blinked, as if he hadn't fully processed what she'd just said. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge, now fully attentive, folded his hands in front of him. "Explain," he said. Amina inhaled deeply, steadying herself before she spoke. She had spent years being trained to respond under pressure, to keep her composure even when everything around her was chaos. This was different, but she refused to let them see weakness. "I served as a combat medic in the US Army," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "2 tours overseas. I've treated soldiers under fire, patched up wounds in war zones, and saved more lives than I can count. And after all of that, I came home to finish medical school." The courtroom remained eerily silent. The judge's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered with something new, interest, maybe even surprise. The prosecutor, who had been so smug just moments ago, seemed to have lost his footing. His jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. One of the arresting officers shifted on his feet, his face paling slightly. The confidence he had earlier, the certainty that he was in control of the situation. "That night I was in the hospital library, studying for an exam, not sneaking around, not committing a crime, just trying to keep up with my studies after years of service." She turned toward the officers, fixing them with a steady gaze. "And yet, I was tackled to the ground and arrested, like a criminal." The second officer, the one who had cuffed her, opened his mouth as if to respond, but then closed it again. Her lawyer, suddenly far more interested in the case than before, straightened his tie and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, my client is not only a medical student, but also a decorated veteran. She has multiple commendations, including the Bronze Star for bravery under fire. She's spent years saving lives, and now she's being accused of trespassing in the very hospital where she's training to become a doctor." The judge let out a slow breath, then turned his gaze toward the prosecutor. "Do you have anything to add?" The prosecutor hesitated, flipping through his notes as if he might find something, anything that could justify what had happened. But there was nothing. "No, Your Honor," he finally muttered. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the bench. His gaze landed on the officers. "I assume you were unaware of the defendant's military service when you made the arrest?" The first officer cleared his throat. "No, Your Honor, we didn't know." Amina felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat but swallowed it down. Of course they didn't. They hadn't asked. They hadn't cared. The judge exhaled sharply and shook his head. "I need a 5-minute recess." He banged the gavel, signaling a break. As people began shifting and murmuring around her, Amina sat completely still. She wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing: they weren't looking at her the same way anymore. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as the judge stepped away. Amina sat motionless, her hands resting on the table. In front of her, she could feel the weight of every stare, every shifting glance thrown her way. The moment she had revealed her military service, the air in the room had changed. The prosecutor was no longer smug, no longer in control. The officers who had arrested her stood rigid, their expressions unreadable but their body language tense. They hadn't expected this. They had expected another easy case, another person they could push through the system without resistance. Amina's lawyer, who up until now had barely put in an effort, leaned toward her, speaking in a hushed tone. "Why didn't you tell me you were in the military?" She turned her head slightly, her gaze sharp. "Why didn't you ask?" He had no answer for that. He just pressed his lips together and looked away. The minutes passed slowly before the judge returned. He settled back into his seat, adjusting his glasses as he looked over the case file once more. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured but firm. "Miss Khan," he said, "it is clear to this court that your presence at the hospital that night was not unlawful. There is no evidence that you were in a restricted area, and given your standing as both a medical student and a U.S. Army veteran, there is no reasonable cause to believe you are engaging in any criminal activity." Amina's chest tightened as she braced herself for his next words. "The charges against you are hereby dismissed." A murmur rippled through the room. Amina let out a slow breath, steadying herself. She had known she was innocent. She had known from the moment they slammed her against that wall and shoved cuffs around her wrists. But hearing the judge say it out loud, still hit her in a way she hadn't expected. The prosecutor sat stiffly, his jaw clenched in frustration. He had lost, and he knew it. The officers too stood in silence, their postures less certain than before. The judge continued, this time addressing them directly. This court does not take wrongful arrests lightly. You detained a U.S. citizen without cause, escalated an unnecessary situation, and proceeded to press charges with no substantial evidence. His gaze darkened. You're lucky this case ends here and now. The officers gave clipped nods but said nothing. Amina rose from her seat slowly, her movements controlled. She could feel the heat of the moment, the shift in power. She had walked into this courtroom as the accused, but now she was walking out as something else entirely. As she turned to leave, one of the officers, the one who had first grabbed her, opened his mouth slightly as if to say something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse. She didn't wait to find out. She kept walking. The moment Amina stepped out of the courtroom, the world outside felt louder, sharper. The stale, suffocating air of the courthouse was gone, replaced by the crisp bite of the morning. She should have felt relief. Instead, her shoulders remained tight, her pulse still thrumming with the remnants of anger. A crowd had gathered near the courthouse steps. Reporters, their cameras aimed and ready, murmuring voices spreading through the growing group like wildfire. She had barely made it down the steps before a microphone was shoved in her direction. Miss Khan, can you tell us about the wrongful arrest? How does it feel to have the charges dismissed? Do you think this was racial profiling? The questions came fast, overlapping, each one pushing against her like waves in a storm. She didn't answer. She kept walking, past the flashing cameras, past the microphones, past the faces staring at her with varying degrees of curiosity, sympathy, and something else, something closer to guilt, the hospital. She just wanted to get back to the hospital. Her steps were brisk, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She could still feel the handcuffs, the rough grip of the officers, the cold steel of the police car's cage. It was over, and yet it wasn't. A few blocks down, she spotted a familiar face leaning against a lamppost. Emily, the same nurse who had watched her get arrested and said nothing. For a second, Amina thought she would walk past her, pretend she didn't see her, just like Emily had done that night. But Emily stepped forward hesitantly, her hands twisting together. Amina, she started, her voice uncertain. I saw what happened on the news. Amina met her gaze, waiting. Emily shifted uncomfortably. I should have said something. Back at the hospital, I should have spoken up. Amina exhaled through her nose, her jaw tightening. Yeah, you should have. Emily's face fell, shame pooling in her expression. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. Amina studied her for a long moment. She could see the guilt there, the regret, but it didn't change what had already happened. You didn't have to do anything, Amina said finally. You just had to tell the truth. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but Amina was already walking away. She didn't need apologies. She needed change. The hospital loomed ahead, and for the first time since she had been dragged out of it in cuffs, she felt like she was returning on her own terms. But something had shifted. The place didn't feel the same anymore. She had walked through those doors for years, believing that hard work, sacrifice, and dedication would be enough, that her past, her service, her identity wouldn't be a problem. She knew better now, and she wasn't sure she could ignore it anymore. Amina stepped through the hospital's sliding glass doors, the familiar scent of antiseptic and coffee washing over her. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the bustling lobby, where doctors, nurses, and patients moved about in a quiet storm of controlled chaos. She had walked these halls 100 times before, but today, everything felt different. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, her bruised wrists aching from the pressure. A few glances were thrown her way, curious, cautious, but no one stopped her. The hospital had carried on without her, as if she hadn't been dragged out of here in handcuffs just days ago, as if nothing had happened. Her footsteps were steady, As she approached the main desk, the receptionist, a woman she had seen countless times before, looked up and hesitated for a brief second before offering a forced smile. "Amina," she said, her voice just a little too careful. "Welcome back." Amina didn't acknowledge the tone. She simply nodded and asked, "Where's Dr. Patel?" "In his office," the receptionist answered quickly, already looking relieved to be done with the conversation. Amina turned and made her way through the hallways, the sound of her own breathing loud in her ears. The tension in her chest didn't ease as she passed familiar faces, some of whom gave her weak smiles, while others avoided looking at her altogether. She reached Dr. Patel's office and knocked once before stepping in. He was sitting behind his cluttered desk, flipping through a patient chart, but when he looked up and saw her, he immediately set it down. "Amina," he said, his expression unreadable. "Come in." She closed the door behind her and stood, not yet willing to sit down. "I assume you heard," Dr. Patel sighed, rubbing his temple. "I did." His voice was calm, but there was something else beneath it, something Amina couldn't quite place. "Are you all right?" She let out a slow breath. "I don't know." He nodded, as if he understood. "The hospital administration has been discussing next steps." Amina stiffened. "Next steps? They're worried about attention, the news, the press. You're already a topic online." He paused. "Some people think you should take some time off." Her jaw tightened. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," he said quickly, "and I'm not saying you should step away. I'm just saying that people are watching, and not everyone sees the same story." Amina's hands curled into fists. Not everyone sees the same story. That was the rising in her throat. "I'm here to work, Dr. Patel. That hasn't changed." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," he said simply. "Then let's get back to work." Amina inhaled deeply and turned toward the door. She wasn't done here, not yet. Amina changed into her scrubs with deliberate, steady movements, rolling her shoulders to shake off the stiffness that had settled in her muscles. The fabric felt familiar against her skin, grounding her. She had spent years in uniforms, first in military fatigues, now in hospital scrubs. Both had marked her as something greater than herself, but no uniform had ever been enough to protect her from the way people chose to see her. She stepped into the ER, the rhythm of the hospital washing over her like a tide. Monitors beeped, nurses called out orders, the distant sound of a stretcher's wheels clattered against the tile. It was a world that never stopped moving, and she needed that now, something to focus on, something that reminded her why she had fought so hard to be here. She had barely made it past the nurse's station when she heard a familiar voice behind. Khan." She turned and found herself face to face with one of the arresting officers. For a second, she thought she was imagining it, but no. The uniform, the badge, the same stiff posture were all real. He stood near the entrance, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. Amina's entire body went rigid. He hesitated, then took a step closer. I wanted to talk to you." Her fingers tightened around the patient chart she had just picked up. She had no reason to listen to him, no obligation to give him anything after what he had done. But she wasn't afraid of him, not anymore. She exhaled through her nose. "You've got about 10 seconds before I walk away." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't know," he said. "That night, I didn't know who you were." A humorless laugh nearly escaped her. "Who I was." Because that's all that had mattered to him, wasn't it? If she had been anyone else, just another student, another faceless person in scrubs, he would have assumed the worst, just like he had that night. "You didn't care to know," she corrected, her voice even. He flinched, just barely, but she caught it. I just wanted to say I was wrong." His voice was quieter now. "That what happened, it shouldn't have." Amina stared at him, waiting for the words to settle, for them to mean something. But they didn't. Not really. She glanced around. The ER, the controlled chaos of it, still moving, uncaring, bigger than both of them. "You can go now," she said simply. The officer hesitated, but when she turned her back to him, he understood. A moment later, his footsteps faded down the hall. She didn't watch him leave. There were patients who needed her, lives to save. She had more important things to do. Amina stood in front of the mirror in the hospital locker room, staring at her. Reflection. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, casting a pale glow over her face. Dark circles lingered beneath her eyes, remnants of exhaustion that went deeper than just lack of sleep. The bruises around her wrists were fading, but she could still feel them, still hear the snap of the cuffs locking into place. She reached up, adjusting her hijab with steady fingers. It was the same ritual she had done every day, but today it felt different. Everything felt different. The hospital had returned to its normal rhythm. Nurses moved from room to room, doctors checked charts, patients filled beds, and the world kept spinning as if nothing had changed. But Amina knew she had changed. She couldn't unhear the whispers that followed her through the halls, the cautious glances, the ways some people still avoided meeting her eyes. She wasn't just Amina Khan, medical student anymore. She was Amina Khan, the woman who got arrested for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. She let out a slow breath and turned away from the mirror. There was work to do. As she stepped into the ER, the familiar chaos wrapped around her like armor. A trauma case had just been rushed in. Gunshot wound, mid-30s male, unconscious but still alive. Amina immediately fell into step beside the attending physician, listening to the rapid-fire exchange of vitals and injury assessments. She knew this. This was where she belonged, not in a courtroom, not in a holding cell. Here, a nurse handed her a pair of gloves and she pulled them on, her movements swift and precise, as she pressed her hands against the patient's wound, working to slow the bleeding. The outside world faded. The frustration, the anger, the lingering echoes of injustice, all of it burned away, replaced by the singular focus of keeping someone alive. Time blurred. The patient was stabilized, moved to surgery, and the team began preparing for the next and tossed them into the bin, then leaned against the counter, exhaling. She could still feel her heart pounding, but it wasn't from stress. It was from certainty. Dr. Patel approached, his expression unreadable. "Good work in there?" he said. She nodded. "Thanks." He hesitated, then spoke again. "You thinking about taking any time off?" Amina straightened. "No." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right." And that was that. As she stepped back onto the floor, she felt a shift, not in the hospital, not in the way people looked at her, but in herself. She had been knocked down. She had been doubted, humiliated, arrested, but she was still here, and she wasn't going anywhere.